The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy. Passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants making last-minute checks, and the hum of conversation filling the air. For most people, boarding a plane was just another routine step in getting to their destination. But for one man, what should have been a simple flight was about to turn into something he never expected. Marcus had flown plenty of times before. He wasn't new to airline procedures, nor was he the type to make a scene. He was a professional, dressed in a crisp button-down and jeans, his carry-on neatly tucked under his arm as he made his way to his assigned seat. But the moment he approached it, something felt off. A flight attendant, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and an air of authority, stood in the aisle, arms crossed. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But her expression? It was anything but welcoming. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong seat," she said, her voice clipped and impatient. Marcus glanced at his ticket. "I'm in 12A, he replied politely, holding up his boarding pass. Her eyes flickered to it, but instead of stepping aside, she let out an exasperated sigh. "No, you must have made a mistake," she said. "This seat isn't for you." Passengers nearby shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Some exchanged glances, while others pretended not to notice. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down over something so simple. He kept his voice calm. "I'm pretty sure this is my seat," he said. "Is there an issue?" Her tone sharpened. "Sir, I need you to move to another seat." "Why?" His question was reasonable, but the way she reacted made it clear she didn't like being challenged. Her expression hardened, and a flicker of something, annoyance? Disdain? Flashed across her face. "Because I said so," she snapped. Marcus could feel the weight of other passengers' eyes on him. A few rows down, a couple whispered to each other. A businessman in a suit raised an eyebrow but didn't intervene. And then, a mother sitting across the aisle, holding her young daughter, shifted uncomfortably. At this point, Marcus knew this wasn't just about a seat. He had done nothing wrong. His ticket was correct. So why was she treating him like this? He exhaled slowly, trying to keep his cool. "Look, I paid for this seat. It's on my ticket. If there's a problem, maybe we can get a supervisor to clear it up." The flight attendant's face turned a shade darker, her jaw tightening. "You're being difficult," she accused. "No, ma'am," he said, shaking his head. "I'm just asking for an explanation." The tension in the air thickened. The murmurs grew louder. And then, before anyone could predict what would happen next, another voice cut through the uneasy silence, one that would change everything. A deep voice, steady and firm, broke through the growing tension. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" A second flight attendant, a younger man with a professional yet approachable demeanor, stepped into the scene. His eyes moved between Marcus and the woman standing in front of him. He wasn't aggressive, but there was a quiet authority in his tone, the kind that made people pause. The older flight attendant, whose name tag read Janet, stiffened at his presence. She turned toward him with an expression that was hard to read. Part irritation, part something else. "No problem at all," she said, though her voice was tight. "I'm just asking this passenger to take another seat." The younger flight attendant, whose tag read Eric, frowned slightly. He glanced at Marcus, then at the ticket still in his hand. Without hesitation, he reached out and took a closer look. "This ticket says 12A, Eric said. His voice remained neutral, but there was an unmistakable weight to his words. Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes, well, sometimes seating arrangements change," she said. Marcus, who had been holding back his frustration, finally spoke up again. "If there was a change, shouldn't I have been notified before boarding? Or at least before I sat down?" His voice was still calm, but there was an edge to it now. He wasn't being unreasonable. He just wanted an answer that made sense. A few passengers nearby shifted in their seats. More people were paying attention now, their curiosity piqued by the unusual exchange. Most people expected small inconveniences while flying, delays, baggage mix-ups, maybe even a slightly cranky flight attendant. But something about this situation didn't sit right. Eric seemed to be thinking the same thing. His gaze flicked back to Janet. "Do you have documentation showing a reassignment for this seat?" he asked. Janet hesitated, just for a second. But that second was long enough for Marcus to know she didn't have an answer ready. Instead of responding directly, she shook her head, a little too quickly. "I don't need documentation to manage the seating," she snapped. That was the moment when the energy in the cabin truly shifted. A few people murmured softly to each other. A man in the row behind Marcus let out a quiet, "Ha," as if something about all this was finally clicking in his mind. The mother across the aisle pulled her daughter a little closer. Eric wasn't letting it slide. "Actually," he said carefully, "if a seat reassignment was made after boarding passes were issued, there should be a record of it. I can check with the system right now." For the first time since this exchange began, Janet looked genuinely unsettled. "There's no need for that," she said quickly. "I know how to do my job." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his patience wearing thin. "Then why am I still standing here?" Janet turned back to him sharply. "You're being uncooperative." That word, uncooperative, hung in the air for a moment, heavy with unspoken meaning. It was the kind of word that often got thrown around when someone in a position of authority wanted to shift blame. The kind of word that could turn a simple disagreement into something more. Eric took a small step forward, his expression unreadable. "I think we should handle this the right way," he said, his voice still even. "Let me check the system. If there was an official reassignment, we'll find out." Janet's jaw clenched. For a moment, it seemed like she might push back again. But then she exhaled sharply through her nose and gave Marcus one last hard look before turning on her heel. "I need to check on something," she muttered and walked toward the front of the plane. As soon as she was gone, Eric turned to Marcus, lowering his voice slightly. "I'm really sorry about that," he said. "You shouldn't have had to deal with this." Marcus appreciated the gesture, but he was still confused. "What just happened?" he asked. "Do flight attendants really have the authority to randomly reassign seats like that?" Eric shook his head. "Not without a valid reason," he said. "And definitely not without documentation." Marcus sighed and ran a hand over his face. He had a long flight ahead of him, and this was the last thing he wanted to deal with. "Well, I appreciate you stepping in," he said. "Of course," Eric replied. "Go ahead and take your seat. If there's any real issue, I'll make sure it's handled properly." Marcus nodded, finally placing his carry-on in the overhead bin and sitting down. He could still feel a few eyes on him, but the tension was beginning to ease. At least for now. But just as he buckled his seatbelt, he noticed something. Janet wasn't gone for long. She was back within minutes, but this time, she wasn't alone. Another crew member, someone in a more senior uniform, followed behind her. Their expression was serious, controlled, and the way they were walking toward Marcus told him one thing: this wasn't over yet. The moment Janet returned with the senior crew member, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted again. It wasn't just the murmurs or the way people were glancing up from their phones now. It was the unmistakable tension that spread when people sensed something wasn't right. Marcus, still seated, straightened slightly. He could tell by the way the new crew member carried themselves that they weren't just here for a casual check-in. Their eyes moved from Janet to him, their expression unreadable. "Sir," they started, their voice level but firm. "We need to have a quick conversation about your seat." Marcus exhaled slowly. He wasn't a confrontational person. He had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, once again being treated as if he had caused an issue. "I'm listening," he said, keeping his voice calm. The crew member, whose name tag read Lisa, gave a small nod before continuing. It looks like there was a misunderstanding regarding your seating assignment. We want to clear that up as quickly as possible. Janet, standing beside Lisa, looked impatient, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Marcus glanced at Eric, the flight attendant who had initially stepped in. Eric hadn't moved far, and he was still watching the situation closely. Something about that made Marcus feel like he wasn't entirely alone in this. "What kind of misunderstanding?" Marcus asked, tilting his head slightly. Lisa shifted, as if choosing her words carefully. "There was a claim that this seat had been reassigned," she said. "However, after checking our system, there's no record of that." Marcus let that sit for a moment. He already knew that. He had known it the moment Janet started acting strangely. But now the question was, why? "So I can stay in my seat, then?" he asked. Lisa hesitated, just for a second before nodding. "Yes. There's no reason for you to move." Janet's face hardened at that. She looked like she wanted to argue, like she had something else to say, but Lisa turned toward her before she could get a word out. "Janet, can I speak to you for a moment?" Janet's mouth pressed into a thin line, but she didn't refuse. With one last sharp glance at Marcus, she turned and followed Lisa toward the front of the plane. The moment they were gone, Eric let out a quiet breath and stepped closer. "Are you okay?" he asked in a low voice. Marcus nodded slowly. "Yeah, but I still don't get why this even happened." Eric hesitated, then leaned in slightly, lowering his voice even more. "I don't either. But I can tell you one thing, this isn't normal." Marcus had already figured that out, but hearing it confirmed by someone on the inside made it feel even more unsettling. "What do you think is going on?" Marcus asked. Eric looked around briefly, as if making sure no one else was listening too closely. "I don't want to assume anything, but," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "Janet has been with this airline a long time. She's old school. And not always in a good way." Marcus didn't need him to spell it out. He had felt the underlying tension in Janet's words, in her body language, in the way she had looked at him like he was a problem before he even said a word. Before he could respond, a voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for your patience as we finalize preparations for departure. We should be pushing back from the gate shortly." The announcement signaled that things were moving forward, but Marcus wasn't entirely convinced the situation was over. Lisa and Janet still hadn't returned, and the uneasy feeling in his chest wasn't fading. He glanced down the aisle and noticed a few passengers still watching him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, something like concern. And then, just as he was about to shake it off and settle in for the flight, he caught sight of something through the small gap between the curtains near the front of the plane. Lisa was standing with another crew member. Not Janet this time, but someone else. Their conversation looked serious, and Lisa's expression had shifted from composed to something much more intense. Marcus couldn't hear what they were saying, but the way Lisa gestured, the way the other crew member nodded sharply, it sent a clear message. Something was happening. Something big. And he had a feeling it wasn't going to stay quiet for long. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something was still off. The way Lisa was speaking to the other crew member, the sharp gestures, the way her lips moved quickly. It was clear that whatever was happening wasn't just about a simple seating issue anymore. He shifted slightly in his seat, glancing at Eric, who was now standing a few rows away, observing the front of the plane with the same curiosity. Eric wasn't intervening, but Marcus could tell he was paying attention, maybe even waiting for something. Then, just as Marcus was about to lean back and let it go, Janet reappeared. But this time, she wasn't walking with the same authority she had before. She looked flustered, her movements stiff, her expression tight. And behind her was Lisa, who no longer looked like she was trying to de-escalate anything. She looked like she was here to end it. Passengers picked up on the shift. A few of them stopped talking, others leaned slightly forward, watching as Janet and Lisa made their way down the aisle toward Marcus. The air inside the cabin felt heavier, like everyone could sense that something was about to break. Lisa stopped just beside Marcus's row, looking directly at Janet before speaking. "Janet, do you have anything you'd like to say to this passenger?" Janet's lips parted slightly, like she had been caught off guard. Her eyes darted toward Marcus, then back at Lisa. "I was just trying to." Lisa cut her off. "I checked the system. There was never a reassignment for this seat. And after speaking with other members of the crew, I also learned that this isn't the first time you've had complaints about how you handle certain passengers." The cabin went silent. Not completely, but enough for Marcus to feel the weight of everyone's attention now locked on the conversation happening in front of them. Janet's face paled slightly. "I was just following protocol," she tried again, but her voice had lost its edge. Lisa didn't back down. Protocol doesn't include singling out passengers and trying to remove them from their assigned seats without justification. Marcus felt his pulse pick up. This was more than just a misunderstanding. Lisa had dug into something deeper, something bigger than just this flight. And from the way Janet was reacting, she hadn't expected to be called out so directly. A murmur rippled through the rows behind him. People whispered to each other, trying to piece together what exactly was unfolding before their eyes. Then, as if to put an end to it once and for all, Lisa turned toward Marcus. Her voice was steady, clear, and loud enough for others to hear. "Sir, on behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize for how you were treated. There was no reason for you to be asked to move. And I can assure you, this will be handled immediately." Marcus didn't even have time to respond before Lisa looked back at Janet, her next words sending a ripple through the cabin. "Janet, please gather your things. You're being removed from this flight." The air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Passengers' heads turned, eyes widened, mouths slightly open in shock. No one had expected it to escalate to this. Janet blinked. "What?" "You're done," Lisa said, her tone final. "And not just for this flight. We'll be discussing this further once we land, but for now, you're leaving this plane." The silence that followed was thick. For a long moment, Janet didn't move. She looked around as if searching for someone, anyone, who might come to her defense. But no one did. Not the passengers, not the other flight attendants. Even Eric stayed where he was, his face unreadable. Marcus watched as the weight of it finally sank into Janet's expression. Her shoulders, once squared and rigid with authority, sagged slightly. Her fingers twitched at her sides, and for the first time, Marcus saw something in her eyes that almost resembled fear. Then, without another word, she turned sharply and began walking toward the front of the plane. Her footsteps were quick, her face flushed, her movements stiff with embarrassment. As she disappeared through the curtain, the tension that had gripped the cabin seemed to release all at once. A few passengers let out quiet murmurs, others exchanged looks of disbelief. And somewhere, in one of the rows behind Marcus, someone let out a low whistle. Eric finally stepped forward, giving Marcus a small nod. "I told you this wasn't normal," he said quietly. Marcus exhaled, finally leaning back in his seat. He wasn't sure what had just happened, not completely. But he did know one thing: this flight had already become something he would never forget. And somehow, he had the feeling that neither would Janet. Just as the tension in the cabin seemed to settle, a new ripple of uncertainty spread through the passengers. The intercom crackled to life, and a voice, calm but firm, came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen issue, we will have a brief delay before takeoff. We appreciate your patience." A few passengers groaned, others muttered under their breath. It wasn't unusual for flights to be delayed, but after everything that had just happened, Marcus couldn't help but feel that this wasn't just a coincidence. Eric, who was still nearby, shot a glance toward the front of the plane. His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Instead, he gave Marcus a quick nod before moving toward the front, slipping past the curtain where Lisa and the other crew members had gone. Marcus sat up straighter, suddenly uneasy again. The tension might have disappeared from inside the cabin, but something about that announcement didn't sit right. He glanced around, catching the expressions of a few other passengers. Some were already turning their attention back to their phones or books, ready to move on, but others, especially those who had witnessed the confrontation, still looked wary. Minutes passed. Too many. The delay dragged on longer than expected, and whispers began circulating. Then, movement near the front caught Marcus's eye. Lisa reappeared, but this time, her face was different. The confidence she had when she dismissed Janet was still there, but now, there was something else, urgency. She walked straight to Marcus's row, lowering her voice. "Mr. Parker," she said. Marcus's stomach twisted slightly. She was using his name now. "We need to speak with you privately for a moment." A murmur passed through the nearby rows. Marcus felt a dozen eyes on him. He unbuckled his seatbelt, standing up slowly. "What's going on?" he asked. Lisa's lips pressed together briefly before she gestured for him to follow. "We're just trying to clear something up," she said carefully. "Please, come with me." Marcus hesitated, but something about her expression told him this wasn't optional. As he followed Lisa toward the front, he felt the weight of passengers' stares pressing against his back. He slipped past the curtain, stepping into a small private area near the galley. Inside, two other people were waiting. Eric and another man, someone Marcus hadn't seen before. He wore a dark blazer, and his ID badge was clipped neatly to his shirt. He wasn't part of the flight crew. The man stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, my name is David Whitmore. I oversee flight operations for this airline." Marcus stiffened. "A corporate-level employee? What's this about?" David exchanged a quick glance with Lisa before continuing. "First, I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. That situation was unacceptable, and I appreciate your patience while we handled it." Marcus nodded slowly but didn't say anything. He could tell there was more. David inhaled slightly, then lowered his voice. "However, there's another issue that has come to our attention." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What kind of issue?" Lisa shifted uncomfortably, but David kept his gaze steady. "Shortly after the incident with Janet, we received an internal report flagging your name on this flight." Marcus blinked. "Flagging me? For what?" David exhaled, his expression still calm but serious. "That's what we're trying to determine." The report was marked urgent, and it was submitted by Janet just before she left the aircraft. A slow, burning frustration started creeping into Marcus's chest. "She reported me? For what?" he asked, keeping his voice level. David shook his head. "She didn't provide details. But the timing is concerning." Marcus let out a short, humorless breath. "So let me get this straight. She gets caught trying to remove me from my assigned seat without reason, gets fired on the spot, and then, right before she leaves, she suddenly files a report against me." Eric, standing near the side, spoke up. "It doesn't add up." Lisa folded her arms. "That's exactly why we're looking into it. We don't want to act on bad information, but because it was flagged as urgent, we're required to verify everything before takeoff." Marcus felt a surge of irritation, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had a sinking feeling that this wasn't just Janet being bitter about what had happened. This was personal. He met David's gaze. "So what now? Are you kicking me off the plane?" David shook his head. "Not necessarily. We're running a quick review of her claim, but from everything we've seen so far, there's nothing to support it. However, we need to follow protocol. That's why we're delayed." Marcus exhaled slowly. This wasn't happening. He was being dragged into another mess before the last one had even settled. Lisa glanced at her watch. The review shouldn't take much longer. But Mr. Parker, I have to be honest. Janet has been with this airline for a long time. She knows how to work the system. David nodded. If she did this as retaliation, we need to be thorough in disproving it. Otherwise, it could cause more problems down the line. Marcus clenched his jaw. It was unbelievable. He had done nothing wrong, and yet, here he was, being held up because someone who had already been removed from the plane had thrown one last punch on her way out. He took a slow breath. Fine. Do what you need to do. But I want to make it very clear, I'm not going to sit here and let this happen without pushing back. David studied him for a moment, then nodded. Understood. As Lisa moved toward the intercom to update the crew, Marcus felt a weight settle in his chest. This wasn't over. Not even close. Marcus stood in the small enclosed space, his pulse steady but his mind racing. He had dealt with his fair share of inconveniences while traveling, but this was different. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding or a flight delay. This was someone deliberately trying to mess with him. Lisa spoke into her radio, her voice low and professional. David stood nearby, typing something quickly on his tablet. Eric, who had been mostly silent, crossed his arms and leaned slightly toward Marcus. You know what this looks like, right? Eric said quietly. Marcus glanced at him. Yeah. It looks like Janet is trying to cover herself. Eric nodded. Or worse, trying to flip the script before it even gets written. Marcus clenched his jaw. He didn't know Janet personally, but from the moment she had approached him about his seat, something had felt off. And now, after being removed from the flight, she had filed an urgent report against him? It wasn't a coincidence. Lisa turned back to them, her expression serious. They're almost done with the review, she said. But I just checked something, and you're going to want to hear this. Marcus felt his stomach tighten. She continued, the report Janet filed wasn't just a generic complaint. It was marked under a security concern. Marcus blinked. Security concern? What does that even mean? David sighed, rubbing his forehead briefly. It means she flagged you as a possible security risk, which automatically triggers an internal review. If we hadn't caught it in time, airport security would have been notified before we even had a chance to investigate. Marcus exhaled sharply. You're telling me she tried to have me pulled off the plane by security, after she was the one caught in the wrong? Eric let out a low whistle. That's next level petty. Lisa nodded. And dangerous. If security had been called without us reviewing this first, it could have escalated into something much worse. Marcus felt a flicker of frustration, but underneath it, something else, relief. Lisa and David had handled this internally instead of letting it spiral into something bigger. He wasn't naive enough to think things like this didn't happen, but the idea that Janet had tried to flip the situation so drastically sent a chill down his spine. David glanced at his tablet. Then, after a few more taps, he looked up. All right. The review is complete. There's no evidence supporting her claim, and since she's no longer employed with this airline, the report has been dismissed. Marcus exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his chest finally easing. Lisa gave a firm nod. You're clear to fly, Mr. Parker. And for the record, we're going to make sure this goes on Janet's employment file so she can't pull something like this again elsewhere. Marcus nodded. Appreciate that. David checked his watch. I'll update the captain and let the crew know we're ready for takeoff. He gave Marcus a knowing look. Sorry for the trouble. This should have never happened. Marcus met his gaze. I just hope it doesn't happen to someone else. Lisa led him back through the curtain, and as soon as Marcus stepped into the main cabin again, dozens of eyes turned toward him. Some passengers quickly looked away, others gave him sympathetic nods. He could feel the unspoken questions in the air, but no one dared to ask. As he slid back into his seat, Eric settled in next to him and let out a quiet chuckle. Well, that was a ride. And we haven't even left the ground yet. Marcus smirked slightly, shaking his head. Yeah. Let's hope the rest of this flight is boring. The plane's intercom chimed, and the captain's voice returned, announcing that they had been cleared for takeoff. The engines hummed louder, the slight jerk of movement signaling they were finally ready to go. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a slow breath. It was over. Or so he thought. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, a soft chime rang from his phone. He glanced at the screen, expecting it to be a random notification. Instead, a single message sat there, sent from an unknown number. You got lucky this time. But this isn't over. Marcus felt a slow chill creep up his spine. He turned his head slightly, scanning the faces around him. No one seemed out of place. No one was looking at him. But someone, somewhere, wanted him to know that Janet wasn't the only problem. Marcus stared at the message on his phone, his fingers tightening slightly around the device. The words glowed on the screen, sharp and unmistakable. Someone had sent this intentionally, and they wanted him to know that even though Janet was gone, something else was still in play. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. The last thing he needed was to spiral into paranoia. It could have been Janet herself, trying to stir up more trouble on her way out. Or maybe someone who had been on her side, watching from the shadows, waiting for their turn. Eric noticed the shift in Marcus's expression and leaned over slightly. What's up? Marcus hesitated before turning the screen toward him. Eric read the message, his brows pulling together. He exhaled, shaking his head. Man, this is next-level ridiculous. Marcus locked his phone and slid it into his pocket. Whoever it is, they're trying to rattle me. Eric nodded. Yeah, but why? Janet's out. The airline cleared you. What's left? That was the real question. If this had only been about Janet's petty revenge, the situation should have ended the moment she stepped off the plane. But this message? It meant something, or someone else was involved. The plane lifted off the runway, pressing Marcus back into his seat as the engines roared. The city lights faded beneath them, and for a brief moment, everything else disappeared. He let himself focus on the rhythm of the flight, the steady hum of travel, the quiet murmur of passengers settling in. By the time the seatbelt sign flicked off, Marcus had already decided what to do. He wasn't going to play into the fear. He wasn't going to spend the entire flight looking over his shoulder or overthinking a message that could have come from anyone. Instead, he pulled out his laptop and opened it, focusing on the work he had planned to do before the chaos unfolded. If someone out there thought they could control his mind with a few words, they were wrong. Eric, stretching slightly, gave him a knowing glance. So, we're just gonna pretend that didn't happen? Marcus smirked slightly. Not pretending, just not giving it more power than it deserves. Eric chuckled. Smart. But you better believe I'm watching your back on this flight. The next few hours passed without incident. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, offering drinks and snacks, the hum of quiet conversations filling the space. No one seemed suspicious. No one gave Marcus a second glance. And yet, the message lingered in the back of his mind. When the plane finally began its descent, Marcus felt a sense of relief settle over him. He just wanted to step off, grab his bags, and put this whole experience behind him. As soon as they landed and the cabin doors opened, Marcus and Eric moved with the crowd toward the exit. The airport buzzed with movement, people rushing to their gates, others reuniting with family or checking their phones for directions. Marcus pulled out his phone again. No new messages. No follow-up threats. Maybe it really had been nothing. They reached the baggage claim, waiting for their luggage to appear. Eric tapped at his phone, then glanced at Marcus. You heading straight to your hotel? Marcus nodded. Yeah. Just want to get some sleep. Eric clapped him on the shoulder. Good call. And hey, if you ever need a witness in case Janet or anyone else tries something again, you got my number. Marcus appreciated that. This whole mess had been unpredictable, but at least he hadn't gone through it alone. Their bags finally rolled onto the conveyor belt, and Marcus grabbed his. Just as he slung the strap over his shoulder, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He tensed slightly, pulling it out. Another message. But this time, it wasn't from an unknown number. It was from Lisa. Just wanted to let you know, we're looking deeper into Janet's history. Something about her record isn't adding up. I'll update you if we find anything. Safe travels. Marcus exhaled slowly. So this wasn't just about him. There was something bigger underneath it all. But for now, he had done everything he could. Whatever came next, he would be ready. With one last glance around the airport, Marcus walked toward the exit, stepping out into the night.